And I'm not associated with any organization or any of these. I'm a private citizen.
The one word, I think, that would best describe the quality of Marlon's acting that distinguishes it from other good actors' acting is the word unpredictability. One never seemed to know what he was going to do next. It wasn't that he didn't know what he was going to do next. He knew, but he had that quality of the first time, which made it seem like he was improvising all the time.
He became an actor because that was the only thing he could do. He was in a school play and enjoyed it in high school. Then he wanted to get away from home, as all kids do. So he decided he would go to New York and study acting, because that was the only thing that he had enjoyed. That was when he was 18. He hadn't decided as a young kid. We did a lot of pretending as children. We played cowboys and Indians in the vacant lot next door, and we did pretend things, but it had nothing to do with his always desiring to be an actor at all. But he came to New York, and all of a sudden he was great. His talent was there.
He was going to the new school in the daytime, and I was going at night. I didn't know him then. I just met him, and he was he was going with a very beautiful girl named Blossom Plum at the time. There were many beautiful girls, but it was Blossom. And seeing them together was like it was like a physical jolt, because he was so beautiful and so, it was like an animal force in the room when he came.
When Marlon went for his first interview about I Remember Mama, he was very nervous. He read for the part, and they said, "Fine, you've got the job." And he said, "Thank you very much," and walked into a closet, which many actors have done. They often get the wrong door because they're glad that the interview is over with. They're glad they got the part. They're nervous, and they feel like, they want to get out of the office as quickly as they can. But he said he got in the closet, and then he didn't know how to get out. He didn't know what to say, and he was so embarrassed at having walked into a closet. So he finally walked out and said, "Have I still got the part?"
And what happened was this: the first act started, and there was Mady Christians playing Mama, and Oscar Homolka was the father, and they had a scene and so on. And suddenly, some kid came down the stairs of the set, and I looked at him, and it was so different from the way the others were acting that I thought it was a mistake. And I remember that Esther Williams, who was a swimming star at MGM, happened to be in New York at the same time, happened to be sitting in the theater. She was not with me, but she was sitting in the row in front of me, but I knew her from MGM. And I remember I leaned forward to her and I said, "Esther, that's probably not the kid who's supposed to be playing that part. That kid is probably sick, and they've sent on his understudy." I thought he was a replacement because there was something about him that was so lifelike, as opposed to the busy way in which Mady Christians was, who's a good actress, by the way, but, you know, she was scrubbing the floor with this dry water that you have on the stage, and everything was sort of theater, you know, and suddenly here was this kid, came down the stairs, and it was like he lived in that house.
He was really rather shy, quite a bit shy, at first, when he first started his career. And people have said that he was rude or sullen or uncooperative. And I really do feel that he just didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to get along with strangers. He didn't know who he was. He was just a very young person. And he had not an awful lot of focus at that time. So rather than say something dumb or silly, he just didn't talk at all. He just was very silent.
I met Marlon when I went into a new play called Truckline Cafe by Max Anderson. I went to read for it, but they told me that the role that I wanted to play of the young GI, they said no, that Marlon Brando, or a young man, they didn't even mention his name. The part was cast. I became the understudy to the part and played a smaller role, and there was this young man out there, and it was just brilliant. I mean, it was devastating. What he did and the talent, it was an unforgettable thing and rather a devastating experience for an actor who thought he was pretty good and then bumped into somebody who was a genius. He was very trim, athletic, and curious about everything. He had an enormous curiosity. I recall we went out on the road for this play. Carl Malden was in this play too, by the way. And in some of those films that I've seen again, I shot back there in 1946 and 47. I recall that Carl Malden, an actor named Barry Nelson was in there, and of course Marlon, and Flip, my son, was James Kevin McCarthy, was 2 months old at that time. In those photographs of Marlon walking into the lake out in Bedford Village here, about 35 miles outside of New York City, and Montgomery Clift had been instrumental in helping us find a place to live that summer right after the baby had been born. There was a kind of a tentativeness in the way that Marlon and Monty related to each other, because I think Monty was an established star of the stage and of the screen by that time. But Marlon was coming up fast, as in a race, let's say. You're in the lead, and all of a sudden you can hear somebody's hot breath and the pounding feet behind you coming up very rapidly, and will this person overtake you and race out ahead of you and get the laurels? So Monty, being a young prince of the theater, was, I think, probably sensed something in Marlon that made him a little bit, well, I wouldn't say nervous, but aware, highly aware of Marlon's potent possible threat to his position in the theater. But it wasn't really a threat because they were very different. They both had sense of humor, but I had the feeling that Marlon's sense of humor derived out of, and his talent, his acting ability seemed to come with some sort of intuition. It seemed a natural thing. Whereas Monty's talent wasn't so much intuition, or if it was always overridden by his intelligence. Whereas you think Marlon knew that he was talented and knew somewhere that he didn't give it a thought. He just got into it and played. And that fabulous intuition of his. After that play closed, and it didn't run very long, it was not successful, but it was extremely successful insofar as Marlon was concerned, because of the public and certainly the critics were made aware of this meteoric flash of talent that went across the stage in New York City. And it created an impact. Everybody came to see him the brief time that we were there. Maybe 10 days is about all we must have run after the play came into town from that Baltimore and Schenectady. I think we tried it out in one or two places like that. Play failed with the critics, and Brando's career was launched.
We lived in Omaha, Nebraska until 1929, and Marlon and my sister were closer in age, so that they were great pals, and they used to run away every Sunday for some reason or other, and they would take off their shoes and leave their shoes on the running board of the car and run away. And then we would finally realize that they were gone because we would see the shoes on the running board. And then we would have to drive all over Omaha looking for them. And we would find them in some park or downtown in some store or something. And I was in charge of seeing that they got to school. And they were very unruly. And I would take them to school on a harness so that they wouldn't run away from me. That for, first couple of weeks. Then they learned how to behave. But my mother and father were lenient parents. My father's stricter than my mother. And our house was full of books and music, and mother was a very good cook. And my father was out of town a lot. He traveled in his work. And so mother was half child herself. And so we really had a very easy, fun kind of life. Marlon, he was funny, and he was sometimes very naughty, but he was sort of a lone person. He would go off by himself and think his serious young thoughts. And he was very competitive. We used to have contests all the time. He, my sister, and I, who could count the cards fastest, who could wash the dishes fastest, who could jump better than, who could climb the tree fastest, things like that. We moved to Evanston, Illinois. We lived near Lake Michigan. And I think Marlon was probably a little difficult at school. I remember the principal of the school being in touch with mother a great deal.
It's pranks. He used to tell me he went to school out in Minnesota somewhere, and I'd come from Minnesota, and he went to a school called Shattuck. Shattuck was a military school, and I think, as I recall, he told me one day how he climbed up into the bell tower and somehow loosened the clapper in the bell, and the whole thing fell down all the way through the structure, and I think they threw him out of school for this little prank of his.
Well, the first time I actually got to work with Marlon was the first year of the Actor Studio, when Kazan and I chose the actors. Gadget, who liked to work with, that's Kazan, liked to work with the younger ones. He had Julie Harris and all of those of that age, and then those that were slightly older, at least more experienced, like Marlon and Monty Clift and those, were in my group. And I said to Marlon immediately, I said, look, there's no point in anybody trying to teach you anything about acting. You can act. But what the only point of you coming to class at all would be to stretch yourself in some way and to try things that you so far haven't done, to extend your range. That's the only reason for you to be in a class. So my suggestion to you would be not to do any of these stomach scratching, feet up on the table parts, because you can do that beautifully. But try something that has that's further away from your own behavior patterns and will make you create a character, will transform you. Well, he looked at that with a jaundiced eye. But I said, I'm not talking about you, you know, necessarily being a repertory actor, but it would be good for you. Well, I finally convinced him anyway. And we decided on Reunion in Vienna, which was not all that classical, but at least he would have to be a prince, Habsburg prince. And I said, Marlon, I want the works. I want the Habsburg accent. I want you to get a good accent. I want you to have the Habsburg lip. Put something in there, study the Velázquez paintings, make your face up. I want a uniform and a belt and a sword, a cigarette holder, a monocle. I want the works, everything. Well, he was fainting. He said, good. So the next week he came with everything. He was terrified. And I said, okay, let's go. So he started, the music was playing off stage, the waltz music, and the girl was there. This is a scene about the Archduke Rudolph, who is trying to make a former mistress of his, who has in the meantime gotten married, and he's trying to get her back in this scene. And he came in, and he looked at her, and she was lounging there in the chair, and the waltz music was playing, and he slowly circled around her and kept looking at her, and she kept looking at him, and he circled around, and he got up to her and gave her a crack in the face, slapped her, it nearly knocked her out of her chair. I could see that it wasn't rehearsed, and he picked her up then and gave her a kiss on the mouth that was practically ate half her face away, and threw her back on the chair and said, well, have you ever been kissed like that before? Which was the first line in the play. Well, I want to tell you, he was like the young John Barrymore, leading man type, funny and attractive and sexy, and it was a knockout. Anybody who was there that day, and there was Mildred Dunnock and just Beatrice Straight and Monty, and everybody who was there that day and saw that scene, Maureen Stapleton, we still talk about it to this day. It was, you know, everybody said, my God, there's nothing that this boy can't do then.
Every man or male star would like to look like Marlon Brando. And it's a strange psychological thing about Marlon, is that, especially in his youth, he didn't care for his looks. He resented, and probably still does, his handsomeness. And he had a very straight nose. And it was during the play of Streetcar, particularly on matinee days, in between shows, he would go down the basement and practice boxing with Nick Dennis, one of the players in the play. And Nick at one time had been a professional fighter. And a little fella, Nick was about 5'4". And one day, Nick Dennis threw a punch, and Marlon didn't duck, and hit him right on the nose, the bridge of the nose. And his nose blew up, and Nick broke his nose. And that was the nicest thing that ever happened to Marlon, for Marlon. He wouldn't have the nose fixed. He wouldn't go to the hospital for splints. And he adored that broken nose. And you kind of understand it. It had to break something that was perfect.
There was a moment after the curtain went up. You had the feeling of New Orleans in the evening, and people behaving in a way that was so real. that you really couldn't believe that you were in a theater. And then all of a sudden this man walked in and threw a package of meat on a table and walked out again, shouting something. And I really thought there'd been a mistake. I thought one of the stagehands had walked in, because it was so far above what we had come to think of as acting. There was nothing artificial in it. It was so immediate, so personal, that little moment, that it was a shock. And it really was the moment that changed acting forever in the United States, and the tradition of acting on the screen.
People often made fun of him later for mumbling, but Americans mumble. What he did was break us loose from the whole tradition of trying to be English. For generations, American actors had sounded like stage Englishmen, had put on phony diction, and had tried to sound like somebody else, like people they'd never even met, but like people that they had seen before them on the stage. And suddenly Brando liberated Americans to sound like Americans. It was a revolution in American acting. I don't think it was so much the method, or only the method. It was the fact that Americans then could talk the way Americans really talk.
Hello, folks. I'm Marlon Brando, and this is my sister, Jocelyn.
In this wonderful Yuletide season, we're happy to have you as guests in our home.
Just a minute. I don't think we really need these scripts, do you?
No, we don't need scripts, not to talk about United States saving bonds.
Listen, everybody. This Christmas in our house, like every Christmas in our house, we're going to have United States savings bonds under the tree amongst the other gifts. Because we feel that United States savings bonds are special in this sense, that they're a present with a future.
In our family, we call it the gift that keeps on giving every year.
When he was in Streetcar, his performance was so electrifying that everybody sort of wanted a piece of him. Everybody wanted to find out what he was about, and he got an awful lot of publicity, good and bad publicity. Everybody wanted to write a story about him. He was in every magazine, every newspaper. So that he became a character. He was not a Stanley Kowalski. He's a very gracious, very gentlemanly kind of person. He has impeccable manners. He's a gentle man.
It was in 1951 that I made the film called The Men with Marlon Brando. It was his first film. They did have rehearsal. He had worked a long time ahead of time with Fred Zinnemann, and he had prepared himself for the film by going out to the Veterans Administration Hospital and really getting to know the fellows that he was going to work with, the paraplegics, and learning how to become like them, and learning how they thought and felt and joked, and he'd go out to bars with them, and really lived in the hospital for a while with him. So he came to the film with a great deal of physical preparation for the role. People always ask me, what was it like working with Marlon? And it was a unique experience, because he wasn't like any other actor I've ever worked with. There was both a relaxed reality and at the same time an intensity that was unusual, I think is unusual with actors, except that I see it happening more and more with the actors today, the young actors, who are improvising more and more and have that combination of something that seems just terribly laid back and relaxed, and at the same time underneath that great animal intensity that Marlon has. On the other hand, there were times when he wasn't working that he was like a 12-year-old kid, you know, putting funny things in somebody's dish of soup or something like that, or tying up somebody's costume. I mean, just kind of kiddish pranks that, you know, sort of like you'd expect a 12-year-old boy to do.
He had an apartment on 57th Street and 7th Avenue opposite Carnegie Hall. It was absolutely bare, about 7 rooms, no furniture, just a bed. And he had a raccoon pet. And the raccoon's name was Russell. He tried to train the raccoon, but the raccoon really was a free spirit like himself. And many times the raccoon would hang out of the window, about 7 stories high. And there was a regular occurrence for the fire department to come with the big ladders, coming up there and take up the raccoon, and bang on the window, and hand the raccoon back to Marlon. Now he had this assignment to do Viva Zapata. So he took the raccoon to Texas, and the raccoon became his constant buddy. And at the end of the day, Marlon would go home alone, and the raccoon would follow him. It was like a Charlie Chaplin ending.
We used to drive home. I found him a very peculiar young man, and a very original young man, and he never seemed to want to talk. I mean, never wanted to have a normal conversation. It was always a pretend conversation. He would get in the car and say, "All right, how far are you going, mister?" And suddenly I'd realized that he was improvising, that he was a hitchhiker, and that I was the driver, and that I was driving him someplace. Then he'd start to play one kind of a role. Next day, when I'd say, "Marlon, come on, let's go home," and he'd get in the car, he'd play another kind of a role. So I never really got to know Marlon Brando. Because we were playing brothers, Mr. Kazan suggested that we spend a lot of time together. But we really didn't know what to do with each other. I was totally different from Marlon Brando, and I must say that although I admire him and find him a fascinating human being, I did not feel totally comfortable with Marlon Brando. And that's not in any sense a form of criticism. It's just that maybe our egos, maybe something that do not quite jibe. But because we were supposed to be brothers, Kazan said, I want you fellows to spend a lot of time being together and trying to feel like brothers, so when you're in a scene, there will be a feeling of you like brothers. And one day we were about to do a very important scene, and Marlon Brando, I saw Kazan going over and saying, well, you and Tony better go off and talk. And so we stood off camera, looking at each other, saying, well, what should we talk about? Even though we're going to play brothers, what should we talk about? Until Marlon said, hey, he says, how about going over there by the cactuses? And I said, yeah, what's over there? And he went over and he said, well, at least at least we can relieve ourselves together.
He has a great sense of fun, I think, more than anybody else I've ever met. He derides acting. He doesn't think much of acting. Thinks it's a bastard art form. And he only uses it to make money and to live the life he'd like to live. But for all his protestations about acting, he takes it very seriously. Secretly, before the picture started, he went to Mexico, in the very town where Zapata lived and was born in. And it was there that he studied the speech patterns of people, their behavior, movement.
His personal characterization, which I say personal because it was very much coming from his own person, intrigued and excited, I think, the 50s and 60s audiences, because it represented a spirit of rebellion against the established morality, the established way of thinking about the American situation. And his private life and the characters that he played together coincided with the feeling of protest and rebellion against the established order. Whether this created the so-called Marlon Brando mythology, I don't know. It certainly, in a way, in The Wild One, expressed an unusual lifestyle and unusual relationship to women, and it seemed to catch people's imagination. When Marlon appeared on the screen or in a room among people, he always had what we in the film lingo call presence, meaning you have to look at him, you have to pay attention to him. He demands your attention without doing anything. It was his obvious strength, and it was a kind of a strength that didn't need to be emphasized. He didn't have to play what we call macho today. He just had it, and the more he held it back, the more interesting it was. I am expressing only a very personal opinion and a very personal taste why I liked so much working with Brando, why there was a joining together of our attitudes toward not shouting, not running up with all the flags flying, but rather withholding and let the audience feel what is being withheld. And Marlon has a marvelous ability to do important things seemingly very lightly. He doesn't sit on a line, as we say. Film censorship today is unheard of, that you have to submit your script to an organization and get an okay from an organization that has nothing to do with filmmaking, that is a separate organization set up to judge your scripts. And that was very much the case in the 1950s. And the script of The Wild One, when we submitted it to what was called the Breen office, it was forbidden in toto. The people at the Breen office felt that this is an anti-social group. And yet in the script the sympathy is with the group. I had to get somehow a compromise, something that we could start making the picture. The result of that was that we had to make certain changes. Stanley Kramer and I had to agree to certain line changes. However, as these discussions had gone on without Marlon knowing it, during the shooting he suddenly said, "But this is not the scene I read." And especially a scene that dealt with the question, what are these people like? Why are they like that? Why this violence? What have they got inside that has to come out in terms of racing with the motorcycles and so on? This was banned. So when it came to that scene, Marlon said, "I can't shoot that. This is not what I agreed to, and this is, to me, a very important point of motivation for the character and the scene." While I naturally agreed with him, I had to get ahead. I was responsible. And finally, I said to Marlon, "Look, I agree with you that these new lines are terrible. Let's talk about it anymore. Let's shoot the scene, say it in your own words, what you just told me, why you feel that this explains so much about this gang and these young people." And he said, "Okay." So I took Mary Murphy aside and said, "Look, we are going to improvise the scene. You don't know, and I don't know what Marlon is going to say. It will be the same scene, the same feeling about what it is that these people are doing. Just play along, give the answers, give the questions as he is going to do it, and in terms of your character. Let's shoot it, no rehearsal. Now, I wouldn't have dared to do that with another actor, because usually an actor who has to improvise says, well, yes, what I mean to say is, and the scene is dying slowly. And Marlon was so genuine, and the terrific force that he has, the terrific power of this man, came across on the screen, and everybody understood it much better in the audience than if we had spelled it out like we did in the script. Well, if people ask me how was it to work with Marlon Brando, which I am asked very often, this scene comes to my mind because it is an answer to how it is to work with Marlon Brando. It's sheer pleasure.
By a little spread to tempt you all with this, the winner is Marlon Brando for On the Waterfront. How do you do? How do you do? My very great congratulations. Thank you very much.
In many ways, the waterfront represents what I think is absent in films today, which was the exploration and the development and the intimacy of human beings and their reactions to each other, the progress and the transition of one main character, that played by Brando. It had examined life through more of a human scale than as just a limited scale of shock or sensation like some of these large technical films are of today. It gave an America a view, perhaps, of what really was happening on the waterfront. Not that any one picture can stop racketeering or the underworld, but it did try to give an honest example of what was going on. It was a picture perhaps ahead of its time in a sense, or maybe because of television now or the immediacy of the media we have today, people would be more aware and we might even have more power, but it seems to grow over the years, if for no other reason than because of its humanity and the cast. I think it had one of the finest casts, if not the best cast in American film history. Oh, well, that's the scene for some reason or other that, well, what can I tell you? People love it. They think it's a classic scene. Between Brando and I, we had a very funny experience when we did that scene. We walked into a studio which wasn't very big, and there was only half of a taxi cab. And for some reason or other, the background in back, in other words, the piece that hit in back, a piece of film is supposed to be rolling in back. So when you look through the taxi window, like you would see in back of me, a street as the car drove along, and that would give you the feeling of the taxi moving. Well, for some reason or other, hadn't shown up that morning, and Elia Kazan, the director, got very upset because he had been promised it. There was a little bit of a fight, but I won't go into detail on that between somebody about that. And he said, what can we do? How can we shoot the scene? And one of the men who was working on the camera said, well, listen, I came in a taxi today, and the taxi had a Venetian blind in the back. So Kazan is a man of imagination, and he immediately said, get a Venetian blind. And they put that in the back. But what it did was force the camera to have to come in closer because you couldn't look out the sides. There was nothing to see, except you would see the studio and realize that you were in a studio making a movie in a half a taxi cab. And I think the compression, the fact that they had to stay near heads and stay in close helped make the scene. We worked on it for quite a bit of time. In the beginning, Mr. Brando improvised quite a bit, and we kind of improvised together, and then finally we settled down after rehearsing in front of the camera. First of all, when I work in front of a camera, I consider everything a rehearsal, even when they print it and make it into a movie. And we got to the point finally where we did the two-shot first, and we did his close-up, and then we did my close-up. I think the ironic thing about the scene was that had the real equipment been there, the backdrop, maybe that scene wouldn't have been so strong and perhaps not shot so simply, and therefore it depended more on the ability of the actors in front of it. I'm not saying that because I was one of the actors, but it forced the director to go and just stay with the people in front of the camera instead of doing any different type of shots.
I believe I met him in the makeup room. And years before, I had seen him in a streetcar named Desire on stage. And I was so impressed, as indeed everybody was. And I was in such awe of him, I could hardly speak. And while we were making Desiree, I sort of stayed that way all the time, because I felt instead of acting with him, I was always standing off watching him, because he was incredible to watch. And I guess I still feel that way, anything he does. Now, working with Marlon, I think everybody can learn something from, always the better the actor that you're working with, the better you are. I hope some of it rubbed off, I don't know, because our styles are so different anyway, but I think anybody that would work with him must learn something, unless, of course, egos get in the way. I don't think mine did. Then when we did Guys and Dolls, I was more relaxed, and I think because we were both doing our first musical, because of the music and the fun and the rehearsals and everything, it was much more fun. And I wasn't quite in such awe of him then. The marvelous thing about Marlon, you see, with doing Guys and Dolls, he dared. He dared to do something so different and so unlike him, as people thought. Because he was already so famous for dramatic roles, Streetcar, Named Desire, and Zapata and other stuff. And he dared to do something so different, And I think he enjoyed it. It seemed like he did.
Marlon is a very good actor. He has his highs and his lows. He has this in his life. I mean, he is totally unreasonable and totally fantastic and sweet at the same time. He can be abusive, or he can be very, very charming. I've experienced both of them. How did I meet him? I met him in Paramount Commissary over a lunch. I was having a luncheon date with a very charming Pearl Bailey, and she was telling me who he was and what he was. It didn't strike me that he was a great big movie star that he was, and he didn't represent what a movie star should be like. And the next day, I was working with Spencer Tracy, and Spencer happened to ask me how did I enjoy my evening that night. And I wondered how he knew, and apparently the whole town knew about it, not only me.
Marlon is a foul-weather friend. I mean, you never see him much unless you're sick, then he shows up. Or if you need him, or if I know of someone else that's a very close friend that's in trouble, I call him, and I know he will take care of it, or do whatever has to be done. And he has always been that way. I mean, about 15 years ago, I was quite ill, and I don't think I'd seen him for 2 years. We don't write. I mean, we call maybe once a year or something. And he came to the hospital, and he stayed the whole day. He couldn't have been more charming to the nurses, to everybody. He just really... I mean, that is the kind of man he is. That is the nature of Marlon. But if you're fine and healthy, you don't hear from him. And you don't have to hear from him.
I was in the hospital. I had tuberculosis. And Marlon kept comparing me to his mother, who was a totally different person. She was a very blonde, buxom type lady, very pleasant lady, from what I had gathered. But somehow he compared me with her, and he kept on bringing me her earrings, her rings, her bangles, her possessions, and it gave me a funny feeling. But very soon after that, he proposed marriage to me. To marry an Indian girl is very glamorous, or it sounds very glamorous on paper. But if you have to live it, or you have to be one, in a society where there aren't too many Indians, or in a country where Indians are not known, it's very difficult, and you're not too well accepted.
Marlon's relationship with women has never been totally successful, at least from the outside view. He married twice, both times to Movita and Anna Kashfi, in order to legitimize the sons that his wives were bearing for him. He again had children by Teresa in Tahiti, but he never really worked at any of the marriages, and indeed has had no lasting relationship with women that I know of. Some of this has to do, perhaps, with his relationship to his mother. I'll leave that to the psychiatrists. His mother had a great influence on him. She was active in the theater life in Omaha. She was kind of a frustrated individual and unfortunately turned to drink in later years, and this was a great trauma to Marlon. He felt that she betrayed him. He was never terribly close to his father.
I think the problem started when I was pregnant. And the main issue that came up was that the child would be half Indian. And Marlon came to me and he wanted me to move to Hawaii at that time, which wasn't a state, it was only a territory. And I said, why? When I have all my friends here, my doctor is here, my life is here. Living with him was total confusion. A lot of time was spent talking about his mother. A lot of time was spent with his business associates, meddling in our private lives. We were never left alone to sort of figure out ourselves, our lives, which way we wanted to go with it. We weren't allowed that. Decisions were always made for us.
I enjoyed working with him. Every day was marvelous. The only problem we had when we made Teahouse, The August Moon, was we worked in the monsoon season in Japan, and every day we woke up and looked out the window of the hotel and hoped that there was sun. And there was not, the sun didn't shine very often, and that was a problem. The weather. There was no problem between Marlon and I. As a matter of fact, I think one of the big mistakes a lot of people make is they feel that by criticizing Marlon, that makes them a big person. You can easily criticize a Marlon Brando. He's a giant, and he's probably one of the finest actors I've ever worked with. He was a joy to work with. And we had a great time in Kyoto and Nara in Japan. I have great respect for Marlon. I think he undertook an unbelievable, difficult task in learning to talk Japanese by rote. That is, by saying things. He had to learn very quickly the cadence of the Japanese language. He worked very, very hard, and I think he was marvelous. He was fun to work with. You know, Marlon has a great sense of humor, and he has hopefully like I have. We had it was a lot of fun, you know. We had a great time working.
Unfortunately, he has, as many stars have, the idea that he is the only taste in the world worth listening to. He has his own ideas and on things, and of course they're generally very fine, very good. But sometimes they're not.
And then we had a few fights. He's a passionately dedicated man to his work. At least he was in those days. This was 1957. And I think that he has been wonderful as an actor throughout many of his periods of work in the years that he has worked. I'm not as fond today of his characterizations and work as I was then. But he has his own feelings about acting, and we had 3 very bad fights, I would say, during the show. One was at the end of the picture, when he comes into the wig room, the room where the girls in the Japanese play get and keep their wigs. And he goes into that room where the girl, Miko Taka, was taking off her bridal headdress, and he was to tell her that he was going to defy the army, all the rules of conduct of army men, and that she must also defy the Takaraska heads, and who have rules against their girls marrying anyone, much less an American. And he said that we must get married. Well, when we first rehearsed the scene, Marlon played it in a very vigorous, tough way and shouted at her and was kind of bullying her, as we say in English. And I went over and whispered to him and said, I think maybe you were playing this in the wrong tempo, wrong feeling. And he began shouting at me and telling me that I didn't know what I was doing. And he said, I have to do it this way because I've always got to be brutal in one scene. And I said, well, not this scene, please. This is the end of the picture, and I think the audience would be very upset if they felt that girl was going out with this madman. He said, I'm not a madman. I'm just a man of principle. I said, well, play it as though you were a man of principle. Anyway, we had a terrible argument, and everybody around the set was turning away, embarrassed and covering their faces. And I took him off to a little dressing room in the middle of the stage, a rolling dressing room, the portable. And we kept on this terrible fight. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the fight, just without my knowing it, and he went from screaming his head off to suddenly calming down and saying, I understand what you mean. Come on. Very charming. Played the scene beautifully. And the only thing was, I think he made the fight take place because he was a little unsure of how to play the part, and he was hoping in the argument to find the feeling of the scene. And he did. And I was delighted. I remember that if I were to call him for an assignment to act, and I was not quite ready for him, maybe I'd have to ask him to wait an hour. He would generally, if there were enough Japanese girls there waiting to be photographed, I could sit Marlon Brando down in the middle of them, and he forgot about time. He just had such a good time with any Eastern girls, particularly the little Japanese girls who were the little actresses that we had in Sayonara. He has a humor. For instance, we went to a geisha house in Japan. A geisha house, I think you probably know what it is. It's a restaurant where we are entertained by geisha girls who are trained to make men happy. And I remember that Marlon went kind of crazy. He started making terrible, funny faces because the girls would love it. Really, he was fun to be with whenever we were in Japan. There's no question about that.
I would say the closest thing to a geisha would probably suit his needs the best. He was very impressed when he was doing Teahouse of the August Moon and Sayonara by the Japanese way of life and the Japanese mode of living. And he copied that in his personal life. I remember when we first got married, the first house we bought was a Japanese house. And he took to wearing Japanese kimonos. As a matter of fact, I think he still does. My son complains about it.
I get a feeling always that Marlon in his life has looked for a kind of tranquility of soul. There is about him a side that is extremely tranquil and rational and reasonable, ultimately civilized. I think probably in his mind that culture, Eastern culture, long before it was popular with young people in the 60s and so forth, but I think the culture and religions of the East have probably represented to him some sort of that kind of tranquility, and that perhaps the suggestion that a woman in a relationship with him might bring that from her side, and if he brought that also from his, that would make for a very happy relationship.
I decided to divorce Marlon when I came home from work one day, and I went into my bedroom and I told the nurse, the maid, the nurse, to take care of the baby and go and lie down. And I had fallen asleep, and I got up and I found a certain stillness in the house. And I wondered, what was wrong. So I ran out to her room. I checked the baby first, but I ran out to her room and I found she wasn't there. I ran into the baby's room and everything was fine there. So I ran out into the pool and I found her at the bottom end of the pool. And somehow in the confusion, the news had got out that I had drowned in the pool, not the maid. And Marlon came rushing home and said, "My God, it's you." And I decided then, life is too short. The custody case with my child, it went on for 18 years. He was constantly taken away from me. Marlon kept on pressuring me, or there was pressure put on through the studios. There was always some kind of aggravation, or I was being watched, my calls were being monitored, my car followed. Everything that I did was noted down and carefully documented. I had no chance, no. At that time, I was going through a very difficult time in my own, with my own personal career. I found it very difficult to get a job here. I don't think it had anything personal to do with Marlon, rather than the society around him, really, that sort of stopped me from working. After all the bitterness has died down and the child grown up as a man now, I have nothing but I hope for the best for Marlon. I really mean that.
And then finally we worked together in The Fugitive Kind with Anna Magnani. And it was always great fun working with him, but Marlon can take great pauses and fill them. But if you're the actor acting with him and you can't fill that pause, you're up the creek. So after we rehearsed it once or twice, I said, "Marlon, you're a genius actor. I'm not. I'm just an actor. And I don't know what the hell to do when you're taking those lines. I mean, I could go out, write my will, wash the dishes, write a book." So the next time we went through it, he went like lightning, like... And then he said, "Okay, is that fast enough for you?" But then we reached a compromise.
A lot of actors have not had too good relationships with Marlon during filming. I think the most explosive was when he worked with Anna Magnani in The Fugitive Kind. Here were two very diverse and explosive personalities with entirely different kinds of acting techniques. Because Magnani was very visceral and very emotional and did not like to rehearse. Marlon, on the other hand, was very calculating. He did enjoy rehearsing and checking on things that he could do, and they were at odds from the beginning, and finally They were totally enemies. I think many actors have had the same experience, particularly in Marlon's later years, because he has this knack now of not wanting to learn dialogue, and he simply won't learn dialogue. He says that it gives him a better performance, that he is more natural, and that people talk that way, not reading lines of dialogue from a script, but by making up words and having lapses and pauses and so forth. Marlon likes to disappear in his roles. He is very happy when he can adopt a kind of makeup, a bald head, as in his most recent picture, The Formula, accents, as in The Godfather. He uses this as a kind of way to hide. I think he only really portrayed himself in one picture. It was Last Tango in Paris. I think that was the only time he really gave of himself.
On the One-Eyed Jack's film, he was not only the star, but he was also the director. The film turned out to be 4 hours, and the movie studios cut it down, took the film away from him, and the conventional 2 hours. But they just stuck to plot and storyline and completely lost all the artistry that he had created, diverging off into colorful characterization of the characters within the play and very beautiful pictorial values. And I believe that broke his heart to continue as a director, because he couldn't buck, no matter how big a star he was, he couldn't buck the big studios. He did a very funny thing with Pina Pellicer, young Mexican girl, difficulties within a different setting, working on a picture as a female star to Marlon. And he would constantly rewrite a script. So to get a certain quality out of her, he would give her pickup pills. Now that would bring her all the way up. Then he'd stop and rewrite the scene, and he'd give her a different pill to bring her down. Well, this poor girl went up and down the ladder for days until he got the effect that he wanted. And the picture, One-Eyed Jacks, we were in Death Valley, out in the west. And way out in that desert was a little encampment of Shoshone Indians. And he would play with all those Indian kids, and apparently it was this period that he became very much interested in the culture and the injustice of the American Indian.
I think I would like at this time to give you the deed and the title, which is the quitclaim deed, a letter that relinquishes my claims to the land forever. And also with this, I hope you would receive my sentiments and my apologies for this being a little late, 400 years late. And I'm glad that perhaps in some small way that the relation between the white man and the Indian is here today rectified.
It's not that I have a well thought out analysis of the role that Marlon or Monty Clift or James Dean played in the changing of American cinema. But it's true that up until they exploded on the scene, there wasn't as definitive an American style. Somewhere it had to do with what was happening to our society. It's not an accident that J.D. Salinger was at the same time writing Catcher in the Rye, and that Rebel Without a Cause was written and made into a movie. It was like the precursor of the 1960s was what was happening here. And the fact that Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio had taken this Stanislavski method and applied it to the needs of American culture, which said, you start from your own self, you start from your inside and work out. It's very personal, very subjective, and very real, as opposed to sort of theatrical, external approach to acting. And this, you know, this was like a combustion between these three talents, Clift, Brando, and Dean, and a very, as yet, imperceptible change in our broader culture that just exploded. Very hard to work with Marlon because he has a rhythm. He has his own rhythm that is so strong that it's almost like an undertow. You almost have to dig your heels in to not get drawn into his rhythm. And because each person, each character, of course, has their own rhythm. In the scene that I had with him, and I was an inexperienced, young, insecure actress, trying to do my job, and it was all I could do to not just be sucked into his aura. Powerful, absolutely powerful chemistry. It's just, it goes beyond acting, although he is a brilliant actor. I just saw him again on television in Streetcar Named Desire. It was so non-theatrical, and it was so subjective and specific and personal, and it had never been seen on the screen before, and it's changed movies internationally.
Brando has been perhaps the most daring actor we've ever had on the screen. When you think of the work he did in a movie like Reflections on a Golden Eye, there he was playing a homosexual and he didn't spare himself anything. When that man got on a horse and you saw the way he bounced on that horse, you knew he was a man uncomfortable in his body and in his fat. Everything in some of the performances that he's given has been extraordinarily daring for a major star in American movies. When you think of a man like Robert Redford, he would never dream of allowing himself to play a part in which he would be seen as unflatteringly as Brando has been seen. He hasn't cared about vanity. He has been interested in getting inside the part, and he has played roles that box office stars generally won't go near because they're afraid that the public will then associate them with the qualities of those characters.
I could see that Marlon would fool around off the set, and then the minute they said rehearsal or that the camera was ready and they would shoot, he was just, it made you shiver. He was so different. He was immediately into this man. And there was a sort of, it was like an alchemist. It was like you swallowed something and immediately you became a different color. I mean, he was just a different human being. It was thrilling. It was wonderful working with him, and I wish that it almost made me feel, the whole movie made me feel, because movies are done in such little pieces, that it made me very hungry to to have had that story adapted for a play and to have been able to do long scenes with him, because it was really exciting to watch him work. You couldn't see any work. I mean, it was just a different person there in front of you suddenly. And you didn't know how he did it or how he got there. But it was the character.
Mooning is an interesting metaphor in Marlon's life. Mooning is a kind of adolescent prank whereby a person exposes his backside to either his enemies or his friends as a kind of gesture of contempt or playfulness. And Marlon, in his boyish behavior, found it quite amusing. And during the filming of The Godfather, he and James Caan and Robert Duvall mooned each other. And right after that, when Marlon was making Last Tango in Paris, he himself injected some mooning into the film. When he and Schneider were ejected from the Tango Palace, he showed his contempt to the authorities by taking down his pants. That's the kind of prank that he thinks is funny, and it shows a very boyish kind of sense of humor.
For a man who claims that he doesn't really want to act, he's had the marvelous luck of appearing in two of the greatest movies of recent decades, The Godfather and Last Tango in Paris. And of course, he's been extraordinary in both. He's done things in those two movies that probably no other actor who ever lived could have done. And in the case of Last Tango in Paris, he not only played the part superbly, he really helped create the part because he used material from his own life in the character, and he was able to improvise and bring some of his own qualities into it. That film is such an extraordinary film that it's a great pity that it can't be seen in Italy. Maybe Italy doesn't deserve to have great directors if it treats them as shabbily as it has treated Bertolucci. It's as if Italians don't want to have movies that are imaginative and creative and that really deal with human experiences. They don't want movie directors to be artists, perhaps, because an artist has to deal with the things that mean most to him in his life. And those things are going to involve sex, or the artist won't be truthful. Now, Last Tango became a sensation all over the world because it said something to people that movies had never said before. The characters opened themselves out in ways that people had never done on the screen before.
One evening in Piazza Navona, we were all trying to think of an ideal name actor for the film when I let the name Marlon Brando slip out, almost as a joke, una boutade. One of the people around me got up and said, "Wait a minute, I have to make a phone call." A few minutes later he came back and said, "I'll be speaking to Marlon Brando tomorrow." To make a short story shorter, within a week's time we met, Brando and I, in Paris, at the Hotel Raphael.
Io non credevo ai miei occhi perché Brando
I couldn't believe my eyes, because Brando was one of those legends for me, mythical, a kind of mammoth whom I would never have thought, let alone hoped, to work with. Precisely because he belonged to mythology. And I remember that I told him very rapidly, practically in one breath, about the film, about the idea that I had for it. Actually, it was rather like that he was the director and I the actor. I was rather young, I must say, and he was, well, he was Marlon Brando. Anyway, our first encounter was, well, like a bolt of lightning, love at first sight, in the sense that Marlon accepted to do Last Tango almost immediately. And the first day we began working on Last Tango, after 2 or 3 takes, the cameraman came to me and said, "You know, I have a problem, because when I look at him while he's acting, I forget that I'm working the camera, that I have to move, that I have to follow him. I begin looking through the camera as if I were at the movies, watching a film of Marlon Brando. What I'm trying to say is that Marlon's myth was widespread with all the troupe, the whole team. They were all, well, we were all extremely fascinated by him, and a bit in love with him.
E credo che Marlon fosse molto eccitato.
I believe that Marlon was very excited about the idea of doing a film which was, for the first time, I think, different from all those that he'd done before, in the sense that he didn't have to try to create a character according to Stanislavski, or in the way of the actor's studio, where he had studied and where all the big American actors studied. It was an attempt to look and to see what there was beyond the actor's studio. I remember that at the beginning there was a bit of suspicion, because Marlon is very jealous of his privacy. So when he realized that my method of working was based on excavating in his life, in order to understand, in order to try and steal its secrets, on the one hand he was extremely excited and stimulated, and on the other he was extremely suspicious. However, he did let himself go a lot. I think that at the end of shooting, when he saw himself, he had a certain pleasure in having taken part in the film, and also a bit of doubt as to whether it's right or not to give of oneself in this way.
Darsi in questo modo. Comunque lui si era dato con grande generosità.
In any case, he did give of himself with great generosity. There exist legends about Marlon Brando, the person who has no rapport with others on the set, or as an actor who needs, almost like Eleonora Duse, a tunnel to get from his dressing room to the set. None of these stories are true. Perhaps in some particular film where Marlon was unhappy or extremely bored, he was or he created a problem for a director or the production.
Nel caso di Ultimo Tango a Parigi
With Last Tango in Paris, I must say that the relationship was marvelous, not only with me, but with everyone. Really a pleasure. I'd like to use the word professional, but it seems to me rather overused. What I would say is that he was one of us. I don't know if we are professionals or if we're amateurs or pretending to be professionals, but I do know that the thing that happens always happens when there is a camera and a face like that in front of it.
I think friendship is elusive for Marlon. Anybody in his position must be suspicious of people who want to make his friendship. And often with good reason, because he has been used and he does not want himself to be used. I know of only a handful of people who were really intimate with Marlon and were trusted by him. I've met him on many occasions around the world. I saw him in London when he was making The Countess from Hong Kong. He was very uncomfortable in that film. He didn't get along with Sophia Loren at all. He certainly had respect for Charles Chaplin, but he knew that the whole project was a disaster. But out of gallantry and honor towards this great achiever in the films, Charles Chaplin, he went ahead with it.
What Marlon Brando has in his heart is that the image of Native Americans in this country of the United States should be changed, and that the motion picture industry has dealt with the image of Indian people and helped to degrade it as much as the American government.
There was an awful lot of jokes about that and put-downs of Marlon. And a number of people who knew him and who felt very strongly about his creative ability and his contributions to the industry and to certain causes that he cared about wanted to take an ad in the Hollywood trade papers in defense of him, saying that while they may not have agreed with the way he chose to do that, that it was his right to do that, and so on. And they were busy gathering signatories for that. And they came to me, and while I obviously support that notion completely, I and a number of other people, I think, who were friendly with Marlon and close to him, knew that he would really not want such an ad. He doesn't do it to be defended or applauded or belittled. He just does it because he does it. That's who he is. That's his obligation to the way he leads his life. So I think a great number of things have been said about him that he doesn't really think much about.
Ah, Marlon Brando. Well, listen, I only worked with him for, I guess, about 4 days. I wasn't introduced to him, and I went down to the studio like a couple of days before the day before, and I had to go for makeup tests and costume fittings or whatever, and Marlon was there. And at the end of the day, I suddenly said to the assistant director, listen, what's this? You know, I'm working with him tomorrow. I'm his wife. You know, he's my husband. I've got to meet him. And they said, oh, well, and I guess people were all in awe, rather, of him. And anyway, nobody seemed very keen to take me along to his dressing room, where they all were, but I just couldn't let it go, so I went along, and I knocked at the door, and I said, listen, hi, I'm Susannah, and I'm playing your wife in Where tomorrow, and I just wanted to say hello. And he was terribly nice. He was very warm. I mean, just laughed and said, come in, sit down, have a drink, whatever. And we just talked for about 20 minutes. And he was very relaxed. And all I liked him a lot, because he has a great sense of humor. And I don't know, we were a bit like kids, really, I suppose, in a way, because we had these stupid, silly costumes that if you bent, the silver would become black on the screen, so you'd lose your incandescent glow as Superman's parents. So we used to have to walk up the stairs to the set with our arms terribly straight so that we couldn't bend it, so we didn't create any creases before they shot. And, I mean, it was I think we felt very silly and rather funny. And I remember running through bits of falling polystyrene and roaring with laughter at Monty, and the laughter coming back. And I said to him, isn't this just ridiculous? What we're doing, isn't it just ridiculous? He says, you know, but that's what acting is. A lot of it is just ridiculous, some of it. But it's fun. So I don't know. I liked him. We talked very easily. I didn't get to know him very intimately. You can't in a few days, and it wasn't that kind of film. And anyway, maybe one doesn't with Marlon Brando. Oh, well, that's a silly statement. But anyway, I liked him.